A gun was drawn at Arlington National Cemetery, aimed not at an enemy, but at a black general mourning her fallen soldier. Spit at her feet, accused of being a fraud, she stood frozen as cameras rolled. The question that shook a nation: why did the system see her as an intruder in her own uniform? Before we continue this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. The sky over Arlington that morning carried a heavy stillness, the kind that pressed into the lungs and silenced idle conversation. The rows of headstones stretched endlessly, precise and unyielding, like soldiers in eternal formation. White marble glistened under muted sunlight, each stone a name, each name a sacrifice. A line of mourners moved slowly, their footsteps softened by the grass, their voices hushed, as if they feared to disturb the sacred silence. The air carried the faint rhythm of drums, muted and slow, echoing like a heartbeat that refused to stop. Elise Monroe entered this solemn place not as the decorated general who had commanded thousands, but as a woman carrying grief. In her arms was a simple urn, dark and weighty, holding the ashes of Staff Sergeant Mason Darnell. He had served under her, trusted her, and fallen before his time. Today was not about speeches or medals, it was about dignity. Elise walked without fanfare, her uniform pressed but unadorned, her gaze forward. She wanted to blend into the ceremony, to lay one of her own to rest, nothing more. Around her, the families of the fallen clutched folded flags to their chests. Children held tight to their mothers' hands. Veterans in wheelchairs sat with solemn posture, their eyes wet but unblinking. The kind of grief here was shared, communal, yet deeply private. Elise felt it binding her with every step, the unspoken bond of loss. She paused at the appointed row, the ground freshly turned, and lowered the urn onto the stand that waited. For a brief moment she let her gloved hand rest on it. Her lips parted in silent prayer. Then, like a sharp blade cutting through silk, a voice intruded. "This area is restricted, step away." The words did not belong in a funeral. They were jagged, careless, too loud. Elise turned slowly. Officer Robert Hasker stood there, his uniform stiff, his posture rigid, with a kind of arrogance that felt out of place among so much humility. His hand rested near his belt, his mouth twisted in a smirk that dared her to challenge him. He looked at her not as a mourner, not as a leader of soldiers, but as an intruder. The silence of the crowd broke into ripples of discomfort. Elise answered calmly, her voice low, respectful, controlled. "I'm General Elise Monroe. I have the right to be here." She offered her identification, the card extended firmly, her eyes steady on his. For a moment she expected the simple recognition of her words to end this intrusion. But Hasker did not take the card as a sign of respect. He snatched it like a piece of counterfeit money, sneering as he glanced at it. "This looks fake," he declared, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "You expect me to believe this?" The words echoed across the quiet cemetery, turning solemn silence into disbelief. Mothers pulled their children closer, as though shielding them from something shameful. Veterans shifted in their wheelchairs, their knuckles whitening against armrests. Elise stood motionless, her expression unchanged, though inside her chest a fire pressed against the discipline she had worn all her life. She had faced enemy fire, she had stared down loss after loss, and yet here she was, accused of fraud in the place where her people lay buried. Hasker slapped the hood of a parked SUV, the hollow sound like a gavel striking judgment. He paraded her ID in the air as if it were evidence of deceit. His smirk grew wider, his contempt feeding off the uneasy crowd. Restricted grounds, unauthorized personnel, impersonation of an officer? Each phrase was barked out like charges in a trial he had already decided. The mourners stared, caught between outrage and fear. No one dared step forward. The moment stretched, tight, ready to snap. Then came the gesture that drew gasps. Hasker leaned close, spat at her feet, and let the contempt hang in the air. A child whispered, "Who is she?" and a mother hushed them quickly, her eyes darting nervously. The ground itself seemed to recoil at the insult. Elise remained still, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. The spit on the grass glistened, a stain against sacred ground. "Not real," Hasker declared, shaking the ID card. "She's not who she says she is." His voice rose higher, as though volume could replace truth. Phones began to rise in the crowd, quiet clicks of cameras capturing every detail. Some whispered into live streams, others held back, but all watched. The moment was no longer private. It had become public theater. Elise's jaw tightened. She could have shouted, demanded respect, pulled rank, but she chose restraint. Her silence was louder than his accusations. But silence, in that charged moment, gave Hasker room to escalate further. He reached for his holster. The sound of leather shifting against metal sent a chill through the air. Gasps erupted, sharp and panicked. The crowd froze in disbelief. A funeral had become a standoff. Hasker pulled the gun free, his arms steady, his eyes narrowing as if he were confronting an enemy. The weapon gleamed in the muted sunlight, pointed directly at her chest. Children cried out. Mothers shielded their eyes. Phones shook as cameras zoomed in. The collective breath of the crowd held still. And Elise spoke. Her voice cut through the chaos, calm, measured, unyielding. "If I die here, the entire country will know why." The words carried across the cemetery like a challenge and a prophecy. They struck the ears of every witness, and, through the lenses of dozens of phones, they leapt into the world beyond. A drone, unnoticed until now, hovered overhead, capturing every second of the confrontation. Within minutes, thousands online were watching, commenting, reacting. The sacred grounds of Arlington had become the stage of a national reckoning. Hasker's hands trembled slightly now, though his grip remained on the weapon. His face was taut, his jaw clenched, but the certainty in his eyes wavered under the force of her calm. Around him, the crowd shifted, no longer merely frightened but indignant. Veterans muttered under their breath, families began to murmur. A tide was turning, and it was against him. Military security rushed in, their boots pounding against the earth. Commands were shouted, firm and decisive. "Drop the weapon," one barked. Hasker hesitated, his arrogance faltering in the face of authority he could not dismiss. Two soldiers closed in, their arms steady, their eyes locked on him. The gun lowered reluctantly, his defiance unraveling. In seconds, his wrists were bound in cuffs, his smirk replaced by a stunned glare. The sight of him restrained sent a murmur through the mourners, relief, disbelief, a question of how far things might have gone. The gun was holstered safely by another officer. The ID card, still in Hasker's hand, was retrieved and returned to Elise. She took it with quiet dignity, her face calm, though her heart still beat like the muted drums that had fallen silent. Around her, the mourners watched with heavy eyes. The ceremony resumed, but nothing was the same. The silence now carried the memory of the insult, the image of a gun drawn on sacred ground, the knowledge that grief had been dishonored. And the knowledge that grief had been dishonored. Elise stepped back to the urn. She lowered her head, resting her hand once more on the cool surface, and let out a long, steady breath. The ritual continued, the flag folded with precision, the salute carried out with reverence. Yet every movement felt haunted, scarred by the interruption that had seared itself into memory. For Elise, the act of mourning had been turned into a test of her very identity, her right to belong in the uniform she had earned. When the final note of taps faded into the air, the crowd dispersed slowly, shaken but holding on to the weight of what they had witnessed. Phones stayed in hands, screens glowing with live feeds and recorded videos already spreading. The confrontation would not stay buried within Arlington's gates. It would travel outward, carried on the voices of those who saw, amplified by those who watched from afar. Elise stood alone at the grave a moment longer. Her figure was tall, unbroken, her shadow stretched across the grass. She had come to bury a soldier, but instead she had witnessed the burial of pretense, the notion that respect was equally granted. As she turned to leave, the weight of the urn lifted from her arms, but another weight pressed in, the certainty that this was not the end. It was the beginning. The footage spread like wildfire. Within hours, clips of Officer Hasker spitting at General Elise Monroe's feet and raising his gun at her during the funeral flooded social media. The still images alone were enough to ignite outrage. A decorated black woman, standing tall with folded hands while an armed officer loomed over her on sacred ground. The video carried with it a kind of disbelief that turned quickly into anger. Hashtags erupted across platforms. Funeral Gungate began trending nationally, joined by Honor Our Heroes and Justice for Monroe. It was no longer just a story about a single officer's misconduct. It was a question about who was truly respected in the country's most sacred spaces. Veterans groups spoke first. Statements poured out in quick succession, each condemning the act with blistering clarity. The American Legion called it an assault not just on one woman, but on the dignity of every man and woman who has ever worn the uniform. Another veterans coalition posted a simple message that struck a chord. An attack on her is an attack on all of us. Across the country, veterans began recording themselves in uniform, staring directly into their phone cameras and saying the same words, "We stand with General Monroe." The images stitched together into compilations that went viral, spreading the message like a rallying cry. News anchors replayed the footage in endless loops, their voices thick with incredulity. One commentator asked on live television, "How could this happen at Arlington, of all places? How does a decorated general get treated like a trespasser?" The footage became the centerpiece of evening broadcasts, the gravity of the setting amplifying the sense of violation. Arlington was supposed to be a sanctuary, untouched by politics, prejudice, or arrogance. Yet here was proof that even sacred ground could be poisoned by contempt. Ordinary citizens joined the chorus. Tweets, posts, and messages flooded timelines. Some shared personal stories of loved ones buried at Arlington. Others wrote of fathers and brothers who had served under General Monroe's command. Many simply expressed shame and fury. "My grandfather is buried there," one woman wrote. "The idea that someone could desecrate that space with such hatred is unbearable." The outcry reached across political divides, uniting people who rarely agreed on anything. What they agreed on now was that something had gone terribly wrong, and it demanded accountability. As the night drew on, protests began outside Arlington's gates. Candles flickered in the hands of mourners who gathered not in silence but in defiance. They held signs that read, "Respect our dead" and "Justice for Monroe." Veterans in wheelchairs rolled forward to lead chants. Families with folded flags held them high, as though reminding the nation that sacrifice deserved reverence, not contempt. The confrontation had ended hours earlier, but its aftershocks were only beginning. The next morning, a letter appeared online. It was written by hand, photographed carefully, and posted on the social media account of Ruth Darnell, the widow of Staff Sergeant Mason Darnell. The ink was uneven, the handwriting shaky but resolute. At the top was a simple heading, "For the record." The words that followed cut through the noise with heartbreaking clarity. Ruth wrote, "My husband asked General Elise Monroe to speak at his burial. He trusted her voice to honor his life. Yesterday, she was denied the chance." The letter spread with astonishing speed. News outlets published it in full, anchors reading the words aloud with voices that trembled. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. This was no longer only about the humiliation of a general, it was about the silencing of a widow's final wish for her husband. It was about the denial of dignity to the dead. The outrage multiplied, fueled by grief as much as anger. Veterans' families took to social media to post their own testimonies. Some wrote of ceremonies that had given them peace. Others admitted they feared such peace could be taken away. "If they can do this to a general," one widow posted, "what would they do to the rest of us?" The letter became a rallying cry, carried into town halls, into churches, into the halls of Congress. It was printed in newspapers nationwide, the ink carrying Ruth's grief into every household. Public opinion shifted into something fiercer. It was no longer just about punishing an officer, it was about demanding that the nation uphold the sanctity of its rituals, that it honor the living and the dead with equal respect. Commentators framed it as a moral question. Was Arlington still sacred if prejudice could desecrate it? The debate raged, but most voices agreed on one point: the widow's letter had pierced the heart of the nation. In Washington, the story dominated the front pages. The White House issued a careful statement expressing profound respect for General Monroe's service and promising a review of the incident. But to the public, the words rang hollow. People wanted more than respect. They wanted justice. They wanted acknowledgement that what happened was not an isolated mistake, but part of a deeper sickness that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, Elise Monroe remained silent. She issued no press release, no interviews, no appearances. She returned home quietly, avoiding the spotlight even as it burned hotter with each passing hour. Her silence, far from diminishing the story, only added to its intensity. Commentators began to interpret her restraint as a kind of strength. One anchor said on air, "Her silence speaks louder than speeches. It forces us to wrestle with the images, with what we saw, without being told what to think." The widow's words, paired with Monroe's silence, created a storm that could not be contained. By the third day, the media frenzy had reached its peak. Every major network replayed Monroe's record of service, as though reminding the country who she was. Clips resurfaced of her pulling wounded soldiers from the wreckage of a burning convoy in Afghanistan. Articles highlighted her Purple Heart, her years of command, her role in rescue missions that saved countless lives. She was not just a general, she was a symbol of sacrifice and courage. And yet, in the footage from Arlington, she had been treated as an imposter. The contrast was too stark to ignore. Commentators debated the meaning of it on air. "How does a general become a trespasser at Arlington?" one asked. Another replied, "It's the same way a veteran can be homeless or a hero can be forgotten. It's about who we choose to honor and who we choose to doubt." The conversation deepened. It was not just about Monroe, it was about the way the country valued service, and whether that value was distributed equally. Then came the announcement that shifted the outrage into official action. The Department of Justice declared it was opening a federal investigation. The press release was blunt. "We will examine the desecration of a military ritual and the violation of a federal officer's rights." The phrase desecration of military ritual appeared in headlines everywhere. It gave the anger a name, a legal framework. For the first time, it felt as though the system itself might acknowledge the weight of the wound. Leaks soon added fuel to the fire. Recordings surfaced of Officer Hasker using racial slurs during previous traffic stops. The videos spread quickly, painting a picture of a man whose contempt was not isolated, but habitual. Commentators connected the dots. This was not an accident, one analyst said. It was the inevitable outcome of unchecked prejudice given a badge. The public fury reignited, louder than before. Protests grew in size, spreading from Arlington to other cities. Candles gave way to megaphones. Silence gave way to chants. Through it all, Monroe remained silent. She appeared only once, briefly, standing outside her home as cameras gathered. She did not speak. She only lifted her eyes to the crowd, nodded once, and walked inside. That simple gesture was replayed endlessly, analyzed by commentators who saw in it a kind of moral authority. The nation filled the silence with its own voice. Every protest chant, every editorial, every hashtag became an extension of the words she did not say. By the end of the week, her silence had become the story. It was compared to the restraint of soldiers under fire, the discipline of a commander who knew when to act and when to hold ground. And so the narrative burned hotter, feeding itself. The image of a gun raised at a general during a funeral would not fade. It would only sharpen, demanding answers, demanding change. The trial of Officer Robert Hasker opened in a federal courthouse that seemed to pulse with the weight of the moment. Every seat was filled. Veterans sat shoulder to shoulder with cadets in crisp uniforms. Reporters lined the aisles, pens ready, cameras pointed toward the front. The public had come expecting a reckoning, and the air itself felt charged. When the judge entered, the room rose in near-perfect unison. What followed would not simply be a trial of one man's actions, but a measure of how the nation confronted its own reflection. The prosecution began with words that cut through the tension like steel. The lead attorney, a calm yet forceful woman, opened with a line that was repeated across every news station by evening. This case is about more than a funeral. It is about who America chooses to honor and who America chooses to humiliate. She let the words hang in the air. She spoke of Arlington's sanctity, of the lives laid to rest there, and of the widow's letter that had pierced the conscience of the nation. She painted a picture not of a scuffle, but of desecration, a breach of the very promises the nation made to its soldiers. Her tone was steady, unwavering, as she laid out the charge that Hasker had not only violated Monroe's dignity, but desecrated a sacred ritual of honor. Then came the defense. Hasker's lawyer, a man with a polished tone and sharp suit, leaned heavily into the argument of fear and protocol. This case is not about race, not about prejudice, he declared. This case is about an officer confronted with uncertainty, an officer fearing a breach of security at a sacred site. He gestured toward Hasker, sitting stiffly in his uniform, his jaw tight. My client did not act out of malice. He acted out of duty. He believed he was protecting the sanctity of the grounds. He believed he was doing his job. The defense tried to narrow the lens, to confine the trial to a single moment of supposed confusion. But already the room felt restless. Veterans shifted in their seats. Families who had lost sons and daughters leaned forward, eyes sharp. The contrast between the defense's polished explanation and the raw footage the nation had seen created a tension that words alone could not dissolve. The prosecution's framing of the case as a matter of honor had struck deeper than anyone anticipated. When opening statements closed, the judge's gavel echoed softly, and for a moment the courtroom fell into silence again. The stage had been set. It was no longer just about evidence or legal interpretation. It was about the clash of two visions of what America stood for. The prosecution promised accountability for desecration. The defense promised justification through fear. Between them sat Elise Monroe, silent, waiting. Everyone knew her testimony would decide the trial's direction. When Elise Monroe finally walked to the stand, the entire courtroom rose without being asked. She wore her full dress uniform, every ribbon and medal in place. Her posture was unyielding, her scars visible along the side of her face, etched reminders of battles fought overseas. There was no need for theatrics. Her presence alone was enough to command the room. When she raised her hand to take the oath, the silence was profound. The prosecutor approached with a deliberate calm. "General Monroe, could you tell the court why you were at Arlington on that day?" Her voice was low but steady. "I carried the urn of Staff Sergeant Mason Darnell. His widow asked me to speak for him. I was there to fulfill his final wish." She paused, her gaze moving across the room. "I have stood in war zones where the ground shook beneath me. I have had enemies point weapons at me. But never once did I expect to face the barrel of a gun on American soil, in my own uniform, at the resting place of our dead." The words cut deep. Some in the gallery lowered their eyes, others clenched their fists. The prosecutor let the silence stretch before asking the next question. "How did you respond when Officer Hasker drew his weapon?" Monroe did not flinch. "I stood my ground. I said if I died there, the country would know why, because silence in that moment would have been consent." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. The moment crystallized the entire case. Here was a general refusing to yield to violence, not in a battlefield overseas, but at home, in the most sacred of places. Then came the defense's cross-examination, sharp and unrelenting. Hasker's lawyer leaned against the podium, his voice edged with accusation. "General, you stood there, deliberately. You refused to comply. Would you agree that your refusal escalated the situation?" Her eyes held steady. "No," she said simply. The lawyer pressed harder. "You stood there to provoke him, did you not? You knew people were recording? You knew what effect it would have?" Monroe's voice sharpened, controlled but firm. "I stood there because a soldier asked me to. I stood because it was his right to have his final wishes honored. Silence is not provocation. Dignity is not provocation." The lawyer faltered, searching for another angle, but Monroe did not waver. Her words hung in the air like stone. Veterans in the gallery nodded, some murmuring agreement, before the judge gavel restored order. The clash had revealed the defense's weakness. They sought to blame Monroe for her own dignity, but the weight of her testimony made the argument feel hollow. By the time she stepped down, there was little doubt that her presence had redefined the trial. She had not just testified. She had borne witness to something larger than herself. The courtroom in the days that followed grew into a theater of reckoning. Every seat was filled by sunrise, lines of people stretching outside the courthouse. Veterans arrived in their uniforms, cadets in training pressed against the walls, reporters crammed shoulder to shoulder. When Monroe spoke, silence fell so complete it seemed the building itself was listening. Even the judge, usually stern, appeared to lean in closer during her testimony. The prosecution pressed their advantage. They reminded the jury that the case was not just about an officer pulling a gun. It was about the erosion of dignity at the very core of American ritual. They played the footage again, frame by frame, the spitting at her feet, the slap against the SUV, the smirk as children whispered in confusion. The prosecutor's voice carried over the images. This was not fear. This was contempt. This was not a breach of protocol. This was desecration. The defense continued to argue that Hasker acted under perceived threat, that Arlington's sanctity required heightened vigilance, but each argument fell flatter than the last. Every time Monroe's image was shown, standing unflinching, with a folded flag in her hands, the weight of the defense's words collapsed under the image of her courage. It was during one of the final days of testimony that the prosecution planted the seeds of something larger. While questioning a witness from the military police, they asked a pointed question. Is it true that Officer Hasker had been warned before about his conduct toward minority service members? The defense objected immediately, but the question was enough. The jury had heard it. The gallery had heard it. Reporters scribbled it down. The suggestion was now out in the open that Hasker's actions were not an isolated moment of fear but part of a broader pattern. The prosecution ended the day with a statement that echoed Monroe's restraint. This case is not just about one man. It is about whether we will tolerate the desecration of our rituals, whether we will permit prejudice to taint the soil where our dead rest. This is not about security, this is about honor. As the gavel fell, the courtroom remained suspended in silence. Veterans reached for each other's hands. Families clutched folded flags against their chests. Reporters hurried to file their stories, knowing the words spoken today would resonate far beyond the walls of the courthouse. For Elise Monroe, the trial was not about personal vindication. It was about holding ground for something larger than herself, and though she had spoken few words, the nation heard them louder than any speech. The seeds had been planted. What began as a trial of one officer was opening the door to an exposure of something far greater. The courtroom had already seen its share of drama, but nothing compared to the moment Frederick Hale took the stand. A former officer, long retired, his hands trembled as he raised them to swear the oath. His eyes darted toward the gallery as though expecting shadows to rise against him. He was not there to defend himself or to score points. He was there to unburden a truth that had lived too long in silence. The prosecutor approached carefully, knowing the weight of what was about to be said. "Mr. Hale, can you explain why you've come forward now?" Hale swallowed hard, his voice gravelly from years of disuse. "Because I've watched this department hide behind walls of silence. And because I know what happens when silence becomes the only rule." He paused, his voice shaking. "We were ordered to look away. That was the instruction. When complaints came in about Officer Hasker, when veterans or families raised their voices, we were told it wasn't our concern. We were told to file it away, to forget it ever crossed our desks." The words landed like a hammer. A ripple of disbelief moved through the gallery. Veterans stiffened, reporters leaned forward, and Monroe herself lowered her gaze, as though she had heard something both confirming and damning at once. The defense lawyer leapt to his feet, objecting furiously, but the judge allowed the testimony to continue. The prosecutor pressed on, their tone sharpened. "Mr. Hale, you are saying there was an explicit order within the department to ignore misconduct complaints?" "Yes," Hale whispered. "It wasn't phrased so directly, but we all knew. The phrase was always the same. Keep it off the books. Don't make noise." The man was dangerous, but he was useful. That was the truth we all lived with. The silence that followed was electric. It was the kind of silence that comes when a curtain is pulled back and everyone sees what had always been hidden. The judge's gavel restored order, but nothing could undo the weight of what the jury had heard. For the first time, it was not about one officer losing control at a funeral. It was about an entire structure that had chosen to protect him. When Hale stepped down from the stand, his shoulders sagged as if decades of secrets had finally been carried out of him. The courtroom no longer felt like it was hosting a trial of a single man. It felt like the trial of an entire institution, and the nation, watching from screens across every state, knew it too. The prosecution wasted no time in driving the point deeper. The next day, they introduced into evidence a series of internal memos obtained through subpoena. The papers were yellowed with age, but the words written on them burned with fresh fire. The headline from one memo was read aloud by the prosecutor, each word deliberate. "Hasker is dangerous but useful. Keep him under control." The courtroom froze. The sentence echoed like a confession from the system itself. The prosecutor turned toward the jury. "These are not the words of a rogue officer. These are the words of his superiors. They knew, they recognized the danger, and rather than remove him, rather than protect those he was sworn to serve, they chose to manage him, to weaponize him when useful. This was not oversight. This was complicity." The defense scrambled to frame the memo as misinterpretation, arguing that dangerous but useful was shorthand for his willingness to take difficult assignments. But the weight of the language crushed the explanation flat. Jurors stared, stone-faced, and veterans in the gallery whispered their outrage. As more documents were displayed, the scope widened. Records showed 19 complaints filed against Hasker across a decade. 19, each dismissed without meaningful follow-up. Testimonies from families, service members, even fellow officers had been tucked into drawers and forgotten. And now, laid bare in a courtroom filled with witnesses, the pattern became undeniable. The prosecutor's voice sharpened as they addressed the jury. Silence wasn't weakness, it was policy. "Look at these files. Look at the words scrawled in margins. Phrases like, 'not worth the trouble' or 'keep him moving.' This was not an officer slipping through the cracks. This was an officer carried by the cracks, sustained by the very people meant to hold him accountable." The audience outside the courtroom swelled each day, and their chants carried through the courthouse walls. Veterans raised banners that read, "Protect dignity, not silence." Younger activists held signs painted with the new viral hashtag, "ordered to look away." The streets outside the courthouse became a living embodiment of the words spoken within. Protesters demanded not only justice for Monroe, but an end to the chain of protection that had allowed such desecration to occur. News stations played clips of the memo in bold letters across screens. Commentators struggled to contain their shock. One veteran spoke on live television with tears in his eyes. "We buried our brothers under the promise that their dignity would be preserved. And now we see that promise wasn't broken by one man, but by an entire system that decided convenience was worth more than honor." The impact was devastating. No matter how hard the defense tried to minimize the revelations, the nation had already drawn its conclusions. This was no longer just a trial, it was an excavation of rot. As the revelations poured out, Elise Monroe watched from her seat with the stillness of a soldier accustomed to silence. She did not speak to reporters. She did not respond to the rising chorus of voices outside the courthouse. She remained composed, but the strain showed in the tightness of her jaw, in the way her hands sometimes curled around the edge of the bench. The weight she carried was not just personal. It was the knowledge that her silence, her choice to let the evidence speak, had become its own kind of voice. Inside the courtroom, the chain of protection continued to unravel. Former supervisors were called, each more reluctant than the last. Some admitted under questioning that they had received direct complaints and dismissed them. Others dodged with vague answers that convinced no one. Each testimony layered the same truth. This was not about a single officer. It was about a culture, a system designed to protect itself, even at the cost of desecrating the very rituals meant to bind the nation together. The prosecution emphasized the point. This case began with a funeral interrupted, but what we have uncovered is a funeral for accountability itself. If 19 complaints can be buried, if warnings can be ignored, if danger can be justified as useful, then we are not just burying soldiers, we are burying truth. Outside, the protests grew louder. Veterans in wheelchairs wheeled to the courthouse steps, saluting in silence as younger protesters chanted behind them. Families of the fallen carried photographs of loved ones, holding them high as though demanding they be seen again, demanding that their dignity not be overlooked in the same way. The hashtag "ordered to look away" dominated every platform, becoming more than a slogan. It became an indictment. And yet Monroe's silence carried its own power. Commentators compared it to the silence of soldiers at attention, the silence of folded flags handed into trembling hands. Her refusal to speak publicly only sharpened the weight of her presence. People filled in the silence with their own outrage, their own grief, their own stories. The cracks in the wall were no longer hidden. They were jagged, visible, undeniable, and for the first time the nation was forced to look directly at them. Monroe sat in her chair, her eyes steady, as if to say she had carried heavier burdens before. But even she knew this silence was different. This silence was not about survival, it was about exposure. By the time the gavel fell that day, the trial had transformed into something larger than anyone had foreseen. It was no longer just about Hasker, it was about a system stripped bare. And for those watching across the nation, the question was no longer whether one man would be held accountable. The question was whether the country itself would face the truth, that silence had never been weakness, it had always been policy. The courthouse was quiet when the first declaration was read. It had been prepared by a coalition of black veterans, men and women who had carried the uniform through decades of service. They did not come to offer sympathy. They came to state plainly what Monroe's ordeal meant for all of them. The words struck with a weight that could not be softened. If Monroe isn't safe, none of us are. The phrase was repeated again, slower this time, so there could be no mistaking its gravity. The gallery filled with veterans sat in silence, their posture rigid as if standing in formation. Some had medals pinned to their jackets, others wore faded unit caps, but all carried the same unshakable resolve. To them, Monroe was not just another officer on trial for her dignity. She was the embodiment of every promise broken, every sacrifice disregarded when institutions chose silence over honor. One veteran rose afterward, his cane trembling in his hand, and asked to speak briefly. The judge allowed it, sensing the historic moment unfolding. "I wore the uniform in Korea," the man said, his voice lined with age but firm with conviction. "I fought for a country that sometimes forgot me, but when I saw Monroe stand tall, unflinching, I knew she carried me too. If they can silence her, then every one of us is in danger of being erased." The room did not clap, it did not cheer, it simply held the silence like a folded flag, reverent and unbroken. Reporters scribbled furiously, knowing the line would be carried across headlines within the hour. Outside, the chant picked up quickly, swelling into a refrain that could be heard through the courthouse doors. If Monroe isn't safe, none of us are. The defense attempted to object, claiming the testimonies were irrelevant to the specific charge against Hasker, but the judge ruled that the context was inseparable. The trial was not only about a single act of violence, it was about the dignity of those who wore the uniform, and the systemic failure that had allowed that dignity to be trampled. Monroe sat unmoving through it all, her eyes fixed forward. Yet those who knew her well noticed the faintest tightening at the corner of her eyes, the way her throat rose and fell slowly. She was trained to remain composed, but even she could not remain untouched by the declaration of her peers. The weight of their words did not burden her, it fortified her. The following day brought a new wave of voices into the courtroom. Soldiers who had served directly under Monroe took the stand, one after another, their testimonies weaving a portrait of leadership built not on symbols, but on survival. The first was a sergeant who recounted a night in Afghanistan when their unit had been ambushed. He described the chaos, the gunfire, and how Monroe's command voice cut through the panic. "She moved us out, positioned us with precision, and when I was hit, she dragged me herself. I wouldn't be here if not for her. That's not theory, that's not politics, that's the truth of my life." Another soldier spoke of her discipline, her refusal to bend the rules when shortcuts would have risked lives. "She told us dignity wasn't something you wore on your chest. It was something you carried in how you fought and how you treated others. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. That's why I'm standing here." Then came a Navy SEAL, a man known for his toughness and reluctance to praise. He hesitated at first, then confessed openly. "When I first met her, I didn't trust her. I didn't think a woman could lead men like us. That was my bias, my arrogance. But when bullets flew and I froze, she pulled me back into cover. She saved me when I doubted her. That day she earned my respect, and it never wavered again." The courtroom shifted as the weight of his admission hung in the air. It was not just testimony, it was confession, the acknowledgement of prejudice overcome by truth. Families in the gallery listened intently, some holding photographs of loved ones lost in combat. For them, hearing these stories was more than courtroom evidence. It was confirmation that Monroe had carried their sons and daughters through war with care and courage. The defense tried to undercut the emotional wave, suggesting these were stories meant to manipulate sentiment. But the witnesses stood firm. They were not politicians, they were soldiers. Their words carried the ring of lived truth, sharpened by scars invisible to anyone who had not been in combat. By the end of the day, Monroe's reputation had been reframed before the nation's eyes. No longer was she merely a symbol of disruption at a funeral. She was a proven leader, tested under fire and validated by those who had trusted her with their lives. The testimonies did not end with veterans of war. A group of young cadets was permitted to address the court, their uniforms crisp and their voices clear, though they carried the nervous tremor of youth. They had not fought in battles, but they had been shaped by Monroe's words during their training. One cadet stepped forward, speaking with quiet reverence. "She told us silence is not surrender. She said dignity is not given by rank or medal. It is claimed every time we choose to stand for what is right, even when the cost is heavy." His voice broke slightly, but he steadied himself. "That's why we're here. Because she stood for us before we even had the chance to stand for ourselves." Other cadets echoed his sentiment, describing speeches Monroe had given during their training sessions, moments when she had reminded them that the uniform was not protection from accountability, but a promise to live with integrity. Their presence in the courtroom brought a striking contrast. The wisdom of veterans fused with the hope of the next generation. Families of soldiers filled the benches behind them, watching with tear-stained eyes. Some clasped their hands in prayer, others nodded silently, recognizing Monroe not only as a protector of soldiers, but as a guardian of the values they hoped their children would carry forward. For them, the trial had become a larger reckoning. It was not only about punishing one man. It was about affirming what the uniform was meant to represent. As the cadets finished their statements, the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted again. The narrative had been reframed entirely. Monroe was no longer being portrayed as a passive victim of violence at a funeral. She was revealed as a leader whose life had been dedicated to protecting others, whose choices had saved lives, and whose words had inspired new generations. The prosecutor closed the day by drawing the threads together. This case is not about elevating symbols. It is about recognizing reality. The reality is that Colonel Elise Monroe has lived every value this uniform claims to stand for. And when she was struck down, it was not just her dignity that was assaulted. It was the dignity of every soldier, every veteran, every cadet who looks to her as proof that justice and honor are still possible. The words struck deep, echoing in the silent courtroom. The shift was complete. Monroe was no longer framed by the violence she endured, but by the lives she had touched and the leadership she had proven again and again. By the end of Part 5, the trial had become more than a contest of guilt or innocence. It had become a battle for the very meaning of service. And Monroe, sitting silently yet resolutely, was no longer just one woman under attack. She had become the mirror in which a nation was forced to see itself. The courtroom had been moving at its steady rhythm when the disruption came. Witnesses had finished for the day, the attorneys had started preparing motions for the morning. Then Hasker, shackled but restless in his chair, suddenly rose. His voice cracked out against the hush, demanding to be heard. "Enough of this parade! You want truth, then let me speak it!" Gasps ran through the benches. His lawyer tugged his sleeve, whispering sharply for him to sit down, but Hasker yanked his arm free. His eyes burned with something dangerous. Not the wildness of a desperate man, but the cold determination of someone who had been waiting for this very moment. The judge hesitated, weighing the risk of spectacle against the principle of allowing a defendant voice. Reluctantly, she nodded. "You may speak, but you will be held accountable for every word." Hasker smiled, and it was not a pleasant smile. He straightened his back as though finally free of invisible chains. When he spoke, his voice carried with a clarity that silenced every cough, every shuffle of paper, every hum of a camera. "I am not your villain," he said slowly. "I am your perfect product." The words landed like stones in water, sending ripples through the room. His attorney buried his face in his hands. The prosecutor leaned forward, alert. Reporters scrambled, pens scratching furiously. Hasker continued, his tone almost rehearsed. "You call me brutal, you call me reckless, but look at me. Look at what I have been trained to be. I followed orders, whether they were whispered or written, whether they came from policy or from silence. Do you think I was born ready to strike a woman at a funeral in front of cameras? No. I was shaped for it, sharpened for it, encouraged every time I crossed the line, and no one dared stop me." His voice grew harder. "You cheered when I cleared streets with force. You thanked me when I made dissenters disappear into holding cells. You funded every weapon, every armored truck, every policy that taught me to fear difference and silence challenge. And now you sit here, pretending to be shocked, pretending I am a monster you never knew." The gallery shifted uneasily. Veterans clenched their jaws. Cadets looked down at their hands. The judge banged her gavel once, warning him to keep control, but she did not silence him. The nation was watching. Hasker leaned forward, his hands gripping the table until his knuckles whitened. "I am guilty, yes, but do not mistake me for the disease. I am your symptom. I am every detention without cause. I am every protest crushed under riot shields. I am every file shredded so the truth would not reach the light. I am guilty, but so are you." The last line hung in the air like smoke, filling every corner of the chamber. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. For the first time in the trial, the man on the stand was not just a defendant. He was a mirror. Hasker did not stop. He seemed almost invigorated by the unease he caused, his voice steady as he listed the sins he claimed were not his alone. "You want to talk about complaints," he said, gesturing at the prosecution's files. 19, wasn't it? 19 times someone tried to raise a flag. 19 times supervisors dismissed it as exaggeration. Do you think I silenced those complaints myself? No. They did it for me. The commanders, the captains, the ones who knew exactly what I was and chose to look away because men like me got the job done. He scanned the crowd, his gaze falling on the veterans in the benches. You talk about honor, about dignity. How many times did you return from deployment only to be watched in your own neighborhoods? How many times were you told your service meant nothing once the uniform was off? I enforced those laws. I patrolled those streets. I made sure silence stayed in place. And do you think I invented that system? No, I was rewarded for it. The reporters scribbled furiously, sensing the words would explode far beyond the courtroom. Cameras zoomed in on his face, catching the cold conviction in his eyes. He was not pleading innocence. He was pleading complicity. He lifted his chin. You want more? Let's talk about fear. Mass detention without cause, dressed up as security. Racial profiling, dressed up as precaution. Silencing dissent, dressed up as order. I was told I was protecting America, and when I went too far, you wrote memos calling me dangerous but useful. Useful. You knew exactly who I was. He laughed then, and the sound was chilling. It was not the laugh of a man broken. It was the laugh of a man unveiling a truth too ugly to deny. And now you want to pin it all on me. You want to pretend you are clean while I carry the stain. You want a villain? Fine, but I am not alone in this courtroom. The real jury sits outside these walls. The citizens who know that every time they looked away, they chose me too. The judge struck the gavel again, louder this time, reminding him to restrain himself. But the damage was already done. The gallery was frozen, some in anger, some in shame, some in reflection they did not want to admit. Hasker's lawyer whispered frantically, begging him to stop before he destroyed what little defense remained. Hasker shook his head. This is my defense. This is the only truth left. If I burn, I am not burning alone. Monroe sat unmoving, her face unreadable. She did not rise to his words. She did not interrupt. But those who watched her closely saw the faintest shift in her shoulders, the subtle stillness of someone absorbing every word not as shock, but as confirmation of what she had always known. The air in the courtroom felt charged, as though every breath was carrying more than oxygen. It carried complicity. Outside the courthouse, the word spread like wildfire. Reporters rushed to file stories. Clips of Hasker's monologue aired on live television, repeated across networks and dissected in real time. His phrase, "I am guilty, but so are you," became the headline. Within hours, it turned into a hashtag. I'm guilty. At first, some feared it would be twisted into support for him. But what emerged was something different, something the courtroom had not anticipated. People began using the hashtag not to defend him, but to confess their own complicities. A teacher wrote, "I am guilty for watching my student be treated unfairly and saying nothing." A shopkeeper admitted, "I am guilty for calling the police on boys who looked suspicious just because they were black." Parents confessed to staying silent when their children repeated harmful words. Citizens admitted ignoring protests they did not understand. The phrase became less about Hasker and more about America itself. Not everyone joined in, but enough did to create a wave of uncomfortable reflection. Commentators debated whether it was a moment of reckoning or a passing trend, but the undeniable fact was that his words had struck a nerve. Back inside the courtroom, Monroe sat still as the session closed for the day. Her silence felt heavier than it had in previous moments. She had endured attacks, she had listened to testimony, but this was different. Hasker had turned the mirror outward, and the reflection was unavoidable. Her face betrayed no anger, no outrage, not even visible pain. It was the face of a soldier who had stood in the desert and seen storms roll over the horizon, knowing there was no stopping them, only enduring them. Her silence became its own form of testimony, a reminder that sometimes words were not enough. As the gavel struck to adjourn, the crowd shuffled out, shaken and subdued. Veterans muttered to each other. Cadets filed out in silence. Families clutched one another's hands. Reporters hurried to broadcast the aftermath. And in the center of it all sat Monroe, still as stone, carrying the weight of what had just unfolded. Hasker's monologue had not absolved him. If anything, it had deepened the sense of his guilt, but it had also shifted the ground beneath the trial. No longer was it a simple case of one man's violence against a decorated soldier. It had become a trial of the system itself, with every citizen forced to ask what role they had played in allowing such a man to rise and remain unchecked. The silence of Monroe as she finally stood and left the room carried more power than any words could have. For all his noise, Hasker had made the nation speak, and for all her quiet, Monroe had made it listen. The jury room was a fortress of silence. 12 strangers sat together, the air between them heavy with the burden of what waited outside. Hours stretched into something timeless, as if the clocks in the courthouse had slowed down just to force the nation to hold its breath. Every whisper, every sigh, carried the weight of history. Reporters camped in the halls, broadcasting speculation that filled television screens across the country. Veterans stood at the courthouse steps, their silence forming its own kind of vigil. Families of fallen soldiers held each other's hands, waiting for the sound of footsteps that would mark the end of deliberation. Inside that jury room, the tension carved deep lines into every face. They argued at first, some insisting that Hasker's words from the stand should not blind them to the violence he had committed, while others lingered on his monologue, unsettled by the reflection of complicity he had forced on them. But the photographs, the testimonies, and the bruised dignity of Judge Monroe hung over their debate. Every veteran's story echoed there. Every cadet's trembling words about silence not being surrender found its way into the conversation. Slowly, the jurors began to converge. The law was clear, and the evidence undeniable. Still, the weight of the decision was not in the evidence alone. It was in the knowledge that when they returned, millions of eyes would meet their verdict. This was not just about one man. It was about the shadow he represented, the system that had permitted him, the silence that had let him rise unchecked. To condemn him was to draw a line in the sand, not only for him, but for themselves. At last, they reached agreement. The foreman, a middle-aged teacher whose hands had not stopped trembling since the trial began, signed the paper. He folded it carefully, as if it were fragile glass. Then the knock came, and the bailiff opened the door. Outside, the world waited. When the jurors filed back into the courtroom, the hush was immediate. Even the cameras seemed quieter, their red lights blinking like tiny watchful eyes. Monroe sat still, her face unreadable, her shoulders perfectly aligned as though braced for battle. Veterans sat upright, their uniforms creased and sharp. Families leaned forward, breath caught. The young cadets looked pale, as if they were watching the very definition of justice being carved into stone. Hasker did not shift. Shackled, yet commanding attention, he looked like a man already certain of the ending. His smirk was faint but unmistakable, as though he knew the verdict before it was spoken and wanted to remind the room that no decision could erase what he had said. His words lingered still, echoing through every mind, "I am guilty, but so are you." The foreman rose with the folded paper in his shaking hands. The judge's voice was calm, but the air cracked with tension when she asked, "Has the jury reached a verdict?" He nodded. "We have, Your Honor." The bailiff took the paper and passed it to the clerk. The unfolding of the verdict slip sounded like thunder in the silence. The clerk read slowly, her voice steady but her eyes betraying the tremor of history. On the charge of assaulting Judge Monroe with intent to intimidate, we find the defendant, Robert Hasker, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, guilty. On the charge of aggravated abuse of authority, guilty. On the charge of obstruction, guilty. She paused, drawing a final breath. On the matter of sentencing, we, the jury, recommend life imprisonment. without parole. The room did not explode, it collapsed into silence. The silence that followed was not relief, it was not triumph, it was mourning. The verdict was a stone dropped into a vast ocean, and the ripples carried grief more than celebration. Veterans bowed their heads, families closed their eyes. The young cadets sat frozen, their faces pale, as though they had glimpsed a future that terrified them. Even the reporters, trained to devour such moments, wrote quietly, their pens scratching without the usual rush of adrenaline. Monroe did not move. She sat like marble, her composure absolute. Her stillness was not coldness, but something deeper, something that absorbed the weight of the room without flinching. Every eye turned to her, waiting for some sign, some acknowledgement that the verdict meant something. But she gave none. The absence of reaction became its own lesson. Hasker broke the silence first. He smiled. Shackled hands resting on the table, he leaned slightly forward, his eyes sweeping the courtroom with the calmness of a man who had prepared for this moment. In the end, he said, his voice carrying clearly, "Fear kills everyone." It was not a plea, it was not even defiance, it was something colder. A statement of belief, leapt like a scar across the moment. His lawyer pressed his lips together, unable to stop him. The prosecutor stared, fists clenched. The judge struck her gavel once, sharp and final, but the damage was done. His words would leave with them, carried into the streets, into headlines, into late-night debates. No one clapped. No one cheered. The silence stretched, filled with mourning not only for the violence done, but for the truth revealed about how deep the rot had run. The verdict had punished Hasker, but it had not absolved the nation. It had not erased the complicity he had spoken of. It had not healed the wound. Reporters filed out quietly, some visibly shaken, veterans left with rigid backs and lowered eyes. Families held hands tightly, as though steadying themselves against the tremor of a verdict that did not bring comfort. The cadets whispered among themselves, their voices small, unsure if the justice they had just witnessed was victory or warning. Monroe stood at last, slow and deliberate, her silence heavy as armor. The cameras turned to her, hungry for a reaction, but she gave them none. Her silence became the closing statement, louder than any words she could have spoken. She walked with steady steps toward the exit, her presence parting the crowd without a single gesture. As she passed the rows of benches, a hand reached out, small, hesitant. A boy stood there, the same boy who had been at the funeral, the boy whose wide eyes had seen Hasker's hand strike Monroe down. He had followed the trial, clinging to the idea that somehow she would explain what he had witnessed. Now, as the crowd thinned, he stood in her path, trembling. His voice cracked with the innocence of someone who had seen too much. "Why didn't you move?" he asked. The room stilled again. Reporters froze, pens hovering. Veterans turned. Cadets leaned forward. It was the question everyone had carried silently since that first day, the question that refused to be buried. Monroe looked at him, her eyes steady, her face unreadable. She did not speak. Her silence was not emptiness but deliberate, a refusal to reduce the answer to words. The boy's eyes welled with tears. Her silence became his lesson, and through him, it became theirs as well. The silence lingered after the boy's question, stretching across the courtroom like a veil. It was not the silence of avoidance, but of weight, of meaning too vast for words. Monroe stood before him, her gaze unwavering. The boy lowered his eyes, as though realizing that silence could be an answer too. The room breathed in unison, carrying the unspoken lesson. Not all truths can be contained in speech. As Monroe turned to leave, the cameras followed, but they caught something more than an exit. They caught the outline of a leader who carried pain without bending, who chose silence not as retreat, but as defiance against simplification. That silence would echo louder than Hasker's monologue. It would remind everyone that justice was not neat, not comforting, and not always spoken aloud. Outside, the streets were lined with people. Some had camped through the night, Others had traveled across states to stand witness. When word of the verdict reached them, a hush fell even there. No chants, no roars of triumph. Instead, a sea of bowed heads, a moment of collective mourning for what had been revealed about the system they lived under. For many, it was not relief but confirmation of what they had long feared, that men like Hasker had been allowed to thrive because silence had fed them. The hashtag I am guilty surged again, no longer fueled by his words but by the silence of Monroe. People posted the boy's question. They shared her silence. Some mocked it, some exalted it, but all of them recognized it as a moment that would not be forgotten. Silence had become its own kind of speech. Later, when Monroe returned to her quarters, she remained unreadable. Veterans who tried to approach her found themselves pausing, unsure if words could bridge the gap. Cadets who had looked to her for instruction realized that what she had given them was something far harder than a command. The burden of silence, the discipline of holding truth without adornment. Families who wept in the gallery left with a new kind of sorrow, not because justice had failed, but because justice had revealed itself to be heavier than they had hoped. Hasker was led away, his smirk fading at last as the chains pulled him into the corridors beyond. His words about fear would be replayed, analyzed, and debated. But the moment that endured was not his. It belonged to the boy and to the woman who refused to answer. When the cameras replayed the scene, commentators tried to fill the silence with interpretation. Some said Monroe's silence was dignity. Others said it was exhaustion. Some even accused her of weakness. But those who had been in the courtroom knew better. They had felt the weight of it. They had carried it in their own chests as the silence pressed down on them. It was not weakness. It was the refusal to give easy closure. The verdict had been rendered, the punishment had been decided, but the silence, hers and theirs, would linger long after the gavel struck. It would live in the cadets' memories. It would haunt the veterans who had called her protector. It would shape the young boy who had asked the question, and it would remind a nation that justice is not always loud, not always triumphant, but sometimes unbearably quiet. In the days following the verdict, something unusual began to happen at Arlington. At first it was quiet, almost unnoticeable. A folded piece of paper appeared near the headstone of Colonel Mason Darnell, the man whose funeral had become the stage for outrage and humiliation. The note was short, written in plain script and unsigned. It read, "I turned my back when I should have spoken." The caretakers thought it was a single gesture, perhaps from a soldier or an acquaintance who felt personal guilt. But within hours, more slips of paper appeared. A school teacher left a note confessing how she had ignored her students when they spoke about discrimination at school. A retired officer left a card that read, "I enforced the silence more than once. I am sorry." By the end of that week, dozens of notes had been collected, some tucked under wreaths, some pinned against the stone with small pebbles. Each was a confession, a recognition of complicity in silence. The public began to notice. News outlets picked up the story of the letters. Cameras showed the growing pile of folded papers, many of them handwritten, some of them tear-stained. Anchors described it as a spontaneous reckoning. One commentator said, "It is not about one man or even one act of cruelty. These notes are about all of us." The words spread quickly across the country. Families who had never stepped foot in Arlington felt drawn to participate. Some mailed their notes to veterans groups who promised to deliver them to the graveyard. Others posted images of their handwritten apologies, promising they would journey to the site when they could. Veterans organizations stepped in, helping to preserve the notes and protect them from weather. Volunteers began to laminate each slip of paper, keeping the messages visible. The ritual of confession took on the weight of tradition. It was no longer simply about General Elise Monroe and Deputy Hasker. It had become something larger, something collective. As the pile of apologies grew, they were arranged carefully against the stone. Entire rows of folded notes were stacked in neat lines. From a distance, The grave looked like it had sprouted wings of paper, each page trembling in the wind. One night, a mother brought her 2 teenage sons to Arlington. She knelt by the growing wall of notes and added her own. It said, "I taught my children to stay quiet around police. I told them silence was safety. I regret it now." Her sons watched her press the paper down, and they looked at each other in silence, realizing their family had joined something much greater. By the second week, journalists stopped calling it a pile. They began to call it the Wall of Apologies, even before it had a permanent form. What began as an accident of grief had become a living monument, a gathering place for conscience. The government, still reeling from the trial, was unsure how to respond. Officials hesitated, afraid to appear as though they were co-opting the movement. But the people did not wait for permission. They kept writing, they kept confessing, they kept returning to that grave. It was Ruth Darnell, the widow, who first spoke directly about the notes. Standing before cameras, her voice still trembling with grief, she said, "My husband always believed soldiers stood not for war, but for truth. If these letters are truth, then I welcome them. Let them stand beside him." Her words gave blessing to what was happening. From that moment, the notes no longer felt like intrusions. They felt like a duty, a promise to the dead. The Wall of Apologies was no longer a nickname. It was a reality in the making. As weeks passed, the Wall of Apologies grew too large to remain a fragile collection of papers. Rain threatened to destroy them even with lamination. Volunteers realized they needed permanence. The idea spread: build a true wall, not of paper but of steel, and engrave the apologies into its surface so that they would endure. The design came from unexpected places. A group of engineering students from a nearby university drafted sketches. They envisioned repurposing steel from dismantled detention centers, the very cages that had once held people in silence and shame. Veterans groups supported the plan, raising money to transform the steel. It would be melted down, reshaped, and transformed into something entirely different. Soon the effort took on the urgency of a national project. Former prison guards who had quit in disgust donated scraps of metal. Welders worked for free. Families sent donations, however small, to keep the project alive. Each time a new panel was erected, a crowd gathered to watch words appear upon it. The confessions carved into the wall were striking in their honesty. Some were long, whole paragraphs about failures to act. Others were only fragments of regret. One panel read, "I laughed at the joke instead of stopping it." Another said, "I silenced her because it was easier than defending her." Still another read, "I did nothing and it still haunts me." As people read the words, many wept openly. Veterans in uniform stood shoulder to shoulder with school children, tracing their fingers over the engraved sentences. A former Navy SEAL, hardened by years of combat, was filmed crying silently at the wall. He later explained, "I thought I was done with guilt, but seeing these words, I realize I carried silence like a shield." The wall became a pilgrimage site. Families traveled hundreds of miles to stand before it. Teachers brought entire classrooms, urging students to read and reflect. A police officer in full uniform left his own confession, recorded by a television crew. He said, "I enforced silence in my department. I thought it was loyalty. It was cowardice." Social media carried the images to every corner of the nation. Videos of soldiers breaking down in front of the wall went viral. A woman filmed herself placing her confession, whispering to her phone, "I was silent when my neighbor was beaten. I was silent and I regret it." Her tears blurred the camera lens, and millions watched it unfold in real time. The movement expanded beyond Arlington. Across the country, cities began building smaller replicas of the wall, using whatever materials they could find. In some towns, chalkboards were erected in public squares where people could write their apologies. In others, digital screens displayed confessions sent in from around the world. But the original wall in Arlington remained the heart of it all. Each day it grew taller, wider, and heavier, but not in a way that felt oppressive. Its weight was symbolic. a physical reminder of silence carried by millions. The sound of welding became a hymn, echoing across the cemetery grounds as sparks lit the sky. Even skeptics could not ignore the power of what was unfolding. Commentators who once dismissed the notes as empty gestures now admitted the wall had reshaped the national conversation. One journalist wrote, "It is rare to see a nation confess, rarer still to see it immortalized in steel." The movement had transformed from mourning into building. The wall of apologies was no longer just a response to an outrage. It was becoming a new kind of memorial, one that demanded honesty not only about what was done, but about what was left undone. When the wall of apologies stood completed, gleaming in the muted sunlight of Arlington, the question arose of who would dedicate it. Veterans, families, and officials debated endlessly, but in the end, it was not a politician or a general who gave the moment its meaning. It was Elise Monroe herself. She arrived in her uniform, the same one she had worn during the trial. Scars still marked her face and arms, but she carried herself with the same silent composure that had defined her throughout the ordeal. The crowd hushed when she approached. Thousands stood waiting, holding their breath, expecting words that might frame the meaning of the wall. But Monroe did not give a speech. She walked slowly along the panels, reading the engraved confessions. Her gloved fingers traced the steel as though she were feeling the weight of each apology. She paused before one panel that read, "I stayed quiet because I was afraid." She stood there for a long time, her eyes fixed on the words. Finally, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small slip of blank paper. She bent down, placed it carefully at the base of the wall, and stood back. The paper had no words, no confession, no explanation. The crowd did not know how to respond. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then slowly people began to understand. Her blank slip was a statement of its own. Her silence continued. She had carried it from the funeral to the trial, and now she placed it here, leaving it as part of the wall. Reporters asked later why she had left nothing written. Some called it cryptic, others profound, but veterans who had fought alongside her understood. One said, "She has already carried enough weight for us. Her silence speaks louder than any words." The blank slip became one of the most photographed items at the wall. Tourists took pictures of it, children asked about it, and families pointed to it as a reminder that even silence itself could be a confession. The wall's symbolic power deepened after that moment. It was no longer only about apologies written in ink or carved in steel. It was about the spaces left blank, the silences that could not be put into words. Soon, the Wall of Apologies was recognized as a national memorial. Congress voted to protect it, not as a government project, but as a people's monument. Its origin, they declared, belonged not to institutions but to citizens who dared to admit their complicity. Each year, more names and confessions were added. Each year, more people returned to stand in front of it, leaving flowers, tokens, or even blank slips of paper to honor Monroe's act. The wall became not just a memorial for one outrage, but a living reminder of responsibility shared by all. For Monroe, the visit marked the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. She left Arlington quietly, without addressing the crowd. Yet her absence was felt as strongly as her presence. People whispered as she passed, "She is the silence," and in that silence, they found a lesson that no speech could have delivered. The Wall of Apologies stood as a monument, not to perfection, but to imperfection, not to triumph, but to humility. Its steel bore the weight of regret, but also the possibility of renewal. In every confession, in every blank space, in every silence, it carried the hope that the nation might learn to face itself with honesty. And so it remained, standing tall against the horizon, a reminder that silence has power, that apologies have weight, and that even in the aftermath of betrayal, a people can choose to speak at last. The verdict had already sealed Deputy Hasker's fate, but what followed was not punishment in the traditional sense. It was something colder, quieter, and more permanent. Institutions began to erase him. His name, once printed on plaques in police academies and honored on training manuals as a supposed innovator of crowd control, was stripped away almost overnight. At the academy where he once lectured, cadets noticed an empty frame hanging on the wall. The photograph that had carried his smirk and his medal ribbons was gone. No one explained why. The instructors simply skipped over his chapter when they opened the manual. One day his name was there, the next day it was blacked out with thick ink. Students whispered about the omission, but the message was clear. The erasure spread through departments across the country. Internal databases deleted references to his so-called strategies. Court rulings that had once cited his methods as precedent were footnoted differently. His name replaced with clinical language. The transformation was bureaucratic, almost sterile, but its effect was devastating. Hasker was being written out of history. He tried to fight it at first. From prison, he sent letters to editors demanding they restore his record. He claimed his work had kept officers alive. He accused them of cowardice for denying his legacy. But the letters were never printed. Journalists no longer bothered to answer his calls. Even the wardens began returning his complaints unopened. What unsettled Hasker most was not that he was hated. Hatred had always followed him, and in his own mind, hatred had been proof of his strength. What unsettled him now was the absence of acknowledgement altogether. It was as if he had never existed. Young officers entering the academy no longer recognized his name. They studied tactics and legal precedent without realizing who had authored the old frameworks. Professors described the era of his influence as a time of manipulation and cowardice. They told cadets what was once called strategy was nothing but fear dressed in authority. At graduation ceremonies, cadets repeated a new creed, one that emphasized accountability and courage. The lines that Hasker had once forced them to memorize, lines about obedience and silence, were gone. They were not debated or critiqued. They were simply forgotten. In prisons where his methods had been applied most brutally, the reversal was stark. The guards removed posters of him that had hung in break rooms. Training videos were destroyed. No one said his name out loud. The silence around him was deliberate, suffocating. It was not protest, it was annihilation. Inside his cell, Hasker began to pace endlessly. He tried carving his name into the wall, scratching the letters into the concrete with a spoon. But even those scratches were painted over by staff, leaving no trace of his desperation. The institution itself was conspiring to erase him, and he could feel it pressing down on him more heavily than any sentence ever could. His fellow inmates began to notice. They smirked when he introduced himself, pretending not to know who he was. Some called him nobody, others called him ghost. A few even laughed when he tried to assert his old reputation. For a man who had once built his career on authority and fear, it was a deeper punishment than shackles. The world outside had moved on, but inside, the walls of silence closed tighter. Hasker was beginning to vanish, not in body, but in memory. And that was the punishment no court had declared, yet every citizen seemed willing to enforce. In the academic world, the erasure became even more intentional. Scholars who once cited his theories began writing openly against them. Articles appeared in law reviews and criminal justice journals with titles like "Cowardice Dressed as Strategy" and "The Anatomy of Silence as Power." His former framework, once respected, was dissected line by line and condemned as little more than sanctioned abuse. Students at universities were instructed to skip entire sections of older textbooks where his name had been printed. Some professors even removed pages from classroom copies, explaining to their students that history had no use for liars who disguised brutality as discipline. In one recorded lecture, a professor addressed a room full of first-year law students. She held up a textbook and said, "You may see this name in the older editions. Do not mistake it for wisdom. It was cowardice dressed as strategy, and cowardice has no place in justice." The students nodded, writing her words into their notes, knowing they were hearing the final verdict on a man the world had already forgotten. Libraries followed suit. His published essays, once required reading in some training academies, were quietly moved to restricted archives. Some were removed entirely, boxed up and stored in basements. When curious researchers asked about him, librarians shook their heads. The files had been sealed, they explained, or reclassified under headings that made no reference to his name. Even in cultural spaces beyond law and policing, the rejection was unmistakable. Documentary filmmakers refused to use his interviews. Museums of justice and civil rights omitted his contributions. Plays and novels that touched on the themes of power and silence used him as an unnamed archetype, a faceless villain without history. He had been reduced to a symbol, not a man. The transformation extended into prisons themselves. Inmates who had once suffered under his policies spoke out, and their words carried weight now that his name had no defenders. One former prisoner said in an interview, "We were forced to stand in silence because of him. Now he stands in silence because of us." The line went viral, repeated in speeches and carved into protest banners. Even guards, once loyal to his methods, refused to speak of him. Younger recruits were warned against imitating his discipline, told instead that leadership meant listening, not commanding through fear. In the cafeteria, when older guards mentioned his name, younger ones rolled their eyes and asked, "Who cares?" That silence, that disinterest, was its own verdict. Outside the prison walls, former allies began to distance themselves. Politicians who once quoted his theories in speeches now denied ever having met him. Police chiefs who had studied under his system claimed ignorance. Even those who had protected him during the trial avoided his name. In public debates, he ceased to exist as an individual. He was an example of failure, a cautionary tale stripped of personality. The silence spread further still. Search engines de-indexed his name after waves of petitions. His public records remained only in fragments, buried behind disclaimers. Even in the vastness of the digital world, he was being erased, pixel by pixel. The punishment was not swift, not loud. It was drawn out and deliberate, a slow unmaking. The man who had once demanded obedience now found himself alone, erased not by force but by collective refusal. For Hasker, obscurity was worse than chains. For the nation, forgetting him was an act of defiance. The cultural rejection soon became absolute. Hasker no longer had allies, not in institutions, not in politics, not even in the prison system where he lived out his days. His protectors abandoned him. Those who had once called him brother in arms stopped returning his letters. Journalists stopped quoting him, and television producers refused to use his old footage. His face disappeared from the archives. Even his family, distant and silent, stopped visiting. His wife filed for divorce quietly, her statement saying only that she had nothing left to say. His grown children did not answer his calls. For a man who had thrived on authority, isolation was its own sentence. He was no longer feared, no longer defended, no longer remembered. Inside the prison, his downfall deepened. Fellow inmates mocked him with deliberate ignorance. They refused to acknowledge his past, treating him as an ordinary convict with no history. When he tried to correct them, they smiled and walked away, leaving him shouting into silence. To them, the erasure was justice. They had suffered under his shadow, and now they watched that shadow dissolve. Guards participated in the forgetting as well. During roll call, they never said his last name. They referred to him only as inmate. His identification badge was blank. Even the number on his jumpsuit was smudged, faded beyond recognition. In a place where numbers defined existence, his even seemed to slip away. Hasker still tried to cling to fragments of his old self. He scratched his name into scraps of paper, whispered his theories to himself in the dark, and told stories of his influence to anyone who would listen. But no one listened. His words had no echo. He was speaking into a void. As time passed, his reputation dissolved outside the walls too. When his name was mentioned in debates or classrooms, it was only as an example of what not to do. And even then, professors and activists preferred to speak without naming him, reducing him to an anonymous figure of failure. To speak his name, they said, was to give him power, and he had no power left. For all his crimes, the ultimate punishment was not execution or lifelong imprisonment, it was erasure. He was not cancelled in the sense of scandal. He was not a martyr in the eyes of supporters. He was simply forgotten. In the final years of his life, he walked the prison yard alone. No inmates greeted him, no guards addressed him. Even the chaplain passed by his cell without stopping. His pleas for recognition, even for hatred, fell on deaf ears. What he feared most had come true. He no longer mattered. The silence that once empowered him had turned against him. Where once he wielded silence as a weapon, now silence devoured him. He was not remembered as a villain or even as a man. He was remembered only as nothing, a blank space where a name used to be. That was the punishment no court could order, no jury could decide, but which a nation delivered together. To forget him was to declare independence from him. To erase him was to declare that his power was over. And so Haska remained, alive in body but absent in memory, a man undone not by rage or violence, but by the quiet decision of millions to simply look away. Years later, at the Pentagon, a new engraving was unveiled. It was not in marble or bronze, but in steel, clean lines cut into the wall of the Hall of Honor. The inscription read, "Force is not authority. If one day you find yourselves at gunpoint, remember I did not step back." The words were not shouted, not etched in the cadence of a speech. They were carved as if whispered, steady and firm, a reminder that authority was never born from fear, but from courage to resist it. Young cadets who walked the halls stopped before the engraving. Some touched the letters with their fingertips, tracing the steel grooves as if feeling the weight of the moment Monroe had faced. They had all studied it, the day she refused to yield when weapons were leveled against her, the silence she maintained, the steadiness of her body when others trembled. Now the words lived not only in textbooks, but in the walls of the nation's military command. At dedication ceremonies, leaders did not speak long speeches. Instead, they allowed silence to linger in the hall. The absence of noise became part of the ritual, a moment where cadets and generals alike stood still, absorbing the echo of Monroe's defiance. For some, it felt heavier than any anthem. For others, it felt like a call not to forget. Monroe herself never visited the engraving. She said she had no desire to see herself in steel, yet she acknowledged what it meant for those who came after her. Authority, she explained in rare interviews, had been mistaken for the power to command or to coerce. Her words insisted that true authority was not in violence, but in the refusal to submit to it. The Pentagon's decision to inscribe her voice into its walls marked a turning point. No longer was her act seen as rebellion against the system, it was recognized as a form of leadership, as necessary to the integrity of the institution as any battle plan or victory. The same system that had once doubted her now used her name to remind future officers that silence, when it came from courage, could be stronger than orders. Visitors from other nations paused before the engraving, their interpreters whispering translations. Soldiers from abroad asked cadets what it meant to them, and cadets answered that the words were not only about Monroe, but about themselves, about the kind of leaders they chose to become. It was here, in steel letters on a cold wall, that Monroe's story was bound, not to the shame of the past, but to the instruction of the future. She had been a woman pressed against the limits of obedience and power, and instead of breaking, she had stood. That stance now belonged not only to her, but to every young officer who learned to trace her words with steady hands. Military academies across the country began to change their curriculum. In leadership courses, Monroe's case was taught not as scandal or controversy, but as a turning point. Professors placed her alongside great generals and thinkers, not because of her rank, but because of her refusal to betray her conscience when confronted by armed authority. In classrooms, cadets watched recordings of her testimony, her measured voice recounting the moment when weapons pointed at her demanded obedience. They studied the way she had chosen stillness, how her silence exposed the weakness of those who threatened her. The lesson was not about defiance for its own sake. It was about courage without violence, strength without cruelty, leadership without fear. One instructor told his students, "You will face moments where orders and morality will collide. In those moments, remember Monroe. Remember that she chose not to move, not because she lacked fear, but because she understood fear was not authority." The cadets wrote it into their notes, some underlining it as if it were scripture. The phrase to Monroe emerged among them, whispered at first between friends, and then spread through entire academies. It became shorthand for standing firm under pressure, for holding ground without aggression. When cadets faced physical endurance tests, some shouted encouragement to Monroe. When a classmate refused to cheat on a written exam despite pressure, others said, "She Monroe'd it." The name had become a verb, a living practice of strength in silence. Monroe, when asked about it in an interview, shook her head. "I do not wish to be a symbol," she said. "Symbols erase facts. Facts are what matter. What happened was not extraordinary. It was simple. I stood because stepping back would have meant surrendering more than myself." Her words carried humility, but to the cadets they carried weight. She was not mythologizing herself. She was insisting that her action was possible for anyone. The academies taught her story not with grandeur but with clarity. Students debated the ethics of silence as protest, of restraint as power. They argued over whether Monroe had risked too much or whether she had no choice at all. But every debate ended in the same understanding, that her stillness had reshaped the meaning of authority itself. In graduation halls, alongside oaths of service, some cadets whispered her phrase under their breath, a private vow to never mistake force for leadership. What began as a lesson became tradition, and tradition grew into legacy. Monroe had not wanted to be a symbol, but she became a standard. And through the classrooms and training fields, her refusal to step back lived on, echoing louder than any command shouted across a parade ground. In her later years, Monroe often repeated the same thought. "I do not wish to be remembered as a symbol. Symbols are dangerous. They flatten, they erase. I want the record, not the myth." She spoke this not out of bitterness, but out of a quiet insistence on truth. She knew how history could polish rough edges, how it could turn survival into spectacle. Yet despite her wishes, her presence endured. In the barracks of young cadets, the phrase "to Monroe" was written in chalk on walls. In strategy discussions, her name surfaced as a reminder of restraint. In civilian life, activists borrowed her words to remind others that silence could be resistance when wielded with courage. The phrase no longer belonged to her alone. It belonged to those who needed it. To Monroe meant to resist without bending, to stand without retreat, to face the weight of power and remain unbroken. But for Monroe herself, the legacy narrowed to one image. In private reflection, she did not recall the trial or the engraving at the Pentagon. She did not think of the speeches or the debates, or even the cadets chanting her name. When she closed her eyes, she remembered a single, trembling girl. The girl had been standing at the edge of a graduation ceremony, a cadet no older than 21. While others marched and saluted in perfect rhythm, this girl's hand shook as she raised it to her brow. Monroe had seen her, hidden among the crowd, saluting alone. That moment had stayed with her for years. It was not the grandeur of crowds that defined legacy, Monroe believed. It was the courage of one person, trembling but refusing to yield. That was what mattered. That was what endured. In her last recorded remarks, Monroe ended with silence. She did not give closing statements or grand advice. She sat quietly, her eyes steady, her hands folded. The silence was deliberate, echoing the silence she had once used as resistance. Those who watched the recording felt the weight of it, heavier than words could carry. The world moved forward, but her presence lingered in the quiet choices people made. Cadets whispered her name before standing against wrong orders. Teachers pointed to her engraving at the Pentagon. Activists held her words as banners. Yet the truest echo of Monroe lived not in monuments but in stillness, in the moments when people chose not to step back. The final image of her story was not the roar of a crowd or the judgment of a court. It was the image she herself carried until the end, one trembling girl saluting in silence. For Monroe, that was enough. For the world, it was everything. And so her story faded not into noise, but into quiet resistance, a silence that spoke louder than any weapon, louder than any command, a silence that endured.